I didn't think anything could unsettle the rhythm of my life the way it did that summer. On the surface, everything looked stable. I was married, comfortable, routine-bound, the kind of woman people described as dependable. My husband trusted me completely, and I wore that trust like a badge of honor. We had built a quiet life, one that didn't invite questions. But quiet doesn't mean untouched. Sometimes it just means untested. That he had always been around. A familiar presence, never intrusive, always respectful. A family friend, someone who had known us for years, who came and went during gatherings, holidays, casual evenings. I had watched him grow into himself, not as a child, but as someone who had gradually shifted from background noise into something sharper, more aware. I noticed it first in the pauses, the way conversations lingered longer than they needed to, the way his eyes stayed a second too long before looking away. I told myself I was imagining it. I had no reason to think otherwise. The moment everything tilted wasn't dramatic. No music, no sudden confession. Just a quiet afternoon when the house felt too empty. My husband was away, unreachable, and I was alone with my thoughts. He came by for a simple reason, something harmless, or so it seemed. We talked. We always talked. About life, about choices, about how things don't always turn out the way you expect. There was a familiarity there that felt safe, almost comforting. That was the danger. Comfort lowers your guard. Then he said it. Not abruptly, not recklessly. He framed it like a question that had been living inside him for too long. A wish, he called it, though the word felt heavier than that. He didn't touch me. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke honestly, telling me how he had felt for a long time. How he knew it was wrong. How he didn't expect anything. How he just needed me to know. Each sentence sounded careful, but together they formed something undeniable. That I should have stopped him. I should have reminded him of boundaries, of loyalty, of the lines that keep lives from unraveling. Instead, I listened. That was my first mistake. Listening turned into understanding, and understanding into something far more dangerous. He wasn't asking for a future. He wasn't promising anything. That somehow made it worse. There was no illusion to hide behind, no romance to soften the truth. Just desire, raw and unpolished, laid bare in front of me. What surprised me wasn't his confession. It was my reaction. I didn't feel offended or shocked. I felt seen. That realization scared me more than anything he had said. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted without obligation. My marriage wasn't unhappy, but it had grown predictable. Desire had been replaced with routine, passion with familiarity. I hadn't known how much I missed that until it was suddenly placed in my hands. That I told him nothing at first. Silence stretched between us, thick and loaded. I could hear my own breathing, feel my heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Every sensible part of me screamed to shut it down, to send him away, to protect what I had built. But another part of me, quieter but persistent, wondered what it would mean to say yes just once in my life without thinking of consequences. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't sound like my own. I told him I needed time. That I wasn't agreeing to anything. That this couldn't happen. Even as I said it, I knew how fragile those words were. He nodded, respectful, almost relieved that I hadn't rejected him outright. Before he left, he looked at me one last time, not with expectation but with acceptance. As if the choice was already mine. When the door closed behind him, the house felt different. Not empty anymore, but charged. I stood there for a long time, replaying every word, every look. I knew I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't undo. I also knew that pretending it hadn't affected me would be a lie. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just his wish anymore. It was a temptation I had already begun to carry. I told myself the distance would settle things. A few days without seeing him, without replaying that conversation, and everything would return to normal. That's what sensible people believe. But distance doesn't erase temptation, it sharpens it. The absence gave my thoughts room to wander, and every quiet moment seemed to circle back to him. I found myself wondering if he was thinking about me the same way, if he regretted speaking up, or if he was waiting. My husband called every evening like he always did. His voice was familiar, reassuring, filled with routine concerns and small complaints. I answered the same way I always had, attentive, affectionate, careful not to let anything slip. That was when the guilt started, not because I had done something but because part of me felt like I already had. Emotional lines blur long before physical ones do. I could feel myself compartmentalizing, placing my marriage in one box and that conversation in another, pretending they didn't touch. When I saw him again, it wasn't planned. He didn't seek me out, and I didn't invite him. Circumstance brought us into the same space, surrounded by normal life, ordinary noise. He didn't mention what he had said before. He treated me exactly the same, polite, distant even. That restraint unsettled me more than persistence would have. It made me realize the choice was entirely mine. There was no pressure, no pursuit. Just an open door I could walk past or step through. I caught myself watching him, noticing details I had ignored for years. The confidence in the way he spoke, the restraint in the way he carried himself. This wasn't reckless infatuation on his part. It was controlled, deliberate. That made it harder to dismiss as a phase or a mistake. It also made it easier to justify my curiosity. I told myself I was only observing, that curiosity wasn't betrayal. Deep down, I knew that was another lie. Later that night, I replayed my marriage in my head, not the good moments but the spaces in between them. The nights we fell asleep facing opposite directions, the conversations that revolved around logistics instead of feelings. There was love, yes, but it had become efficient, almost managerial. I wondered when I had stopped being a woman and started being a role. Wife, partner, responsible adult. Somewhere along the way, desire had stopped being part of the equation. He messaged me first. Nothing explicit. Just a simple acknowledgement of the awkwardness, an apology for putting me in that position. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. I could have ignored it. That would have been the cleanest choice. Instead, I replied. Briefly. Politely. That single message felt heavier than it should have. It was a confirmation, a silent agreement that what existed between us hadn't disappeared. The messages didn't escalate quickly. That's another myth people believe, that crossing a line happens all at once. Doesn't. It inches forward. Conversations deepened. He asked questions no one had asked me in years. Not about my schedule or responsibilities, but about me. What I wanted. What I missed. What I would change if I could. Answering felt dangerous but also intoxicating. Each response felt like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. I was careful. I kept it emotional, intellectual, safe on the surface. I told myself as long as there was no touch, no explicit words, I was still in control. But control is deceptive. It makes you feel powerful right before it slips away. I started anticipating his messages, feeling disappointed when hours passed without one. That's when I knew this was no longer harmless. My mood was shifting based on someone who wasn't my husband. One evening, he asked me directly if I had thought about what he said that day. There was no pressure in the question, just honesty. I could have shut it down then. Instead, I admitted the truth. That I had. That it hadn't been easy to forget. Sending that message felt like stepping onto unstable ground. I knew once it was said, there was no going back to innocence. His reply was simple. He told me he didn't want to be a mistake I regretted. He said if I said no, he would accept it and disappear from that part of my life completely. That should have reassured me. Instead, it terrified me. The idea of losing that connection, even one I wasn't supposed to have, felt heavier than I expected. That was when I realized the line wasn't ahead of me anymore. I was already standing on it, trying to decide which side felt more like myself. I stopped pretending that balance was possible. Every choice began to lean in his direction, even when I tried to correct it. I compared without meaning to. His patience against my husband's distraction. His curiosity against my husband's certainty. The comparison felt unfair, but it happened anyway, quietly rewriting my loyalty. I wasn't falling out of love so much as realizing how long I'd been falling without noticing. That we met more often, always with reasons that sounded responsible. Coffee to talk. A walk to clear my head. Time passed differently around him, stretching and shrinking in ways that made me forget where I was supposed to be. I noticed how my guard lowered without effort, how my laughter came easier. None of it crossed the obvious line, which made it easier to deny that a line existed at all. The tension lived in pauses, in glances that lingered a second too long, in conversations that ended reluctantly, like we were both waiting for something neither of us dared to ask for. I became hyper-aware of myself around him, not in a performative way but in a way that felt newly discovered. As if some part of me had been dormant and was slowly waking up. At home, the contrast sharpened into discomfort. My husband tried in his way. He noticed my distance and responded with effort that felt scheduled, not instinctive. Dinners planned. Apologies offered too late. I recognized the pattern because I'd lived inside it for years, telling myself that effort counted, even when connection didn't follow. Now, effort felt like a reminder of how much I'd settled. The guilt arrived in waves. It showed up when my husband reached for me and I felt absent, when he spoke about the future and I pictured an emptiness instead of a shared vision. I hadn't confessed anything, but my thoughts felt like evidence. I wondered if emotional betrayal required witnesses, or if intention alone was enough to condemn me. The night everything shifted, nothing dramatic happened. No confession. No touch. Just honesty, stripped of its protective layers. We spoke about regret. About the lives we thought we'd have. About how easily people lose themselves trying to be dependable. When I admitted how trapped I felt, he didn't offer escape. He offered understanding. That was enough to undo me. I realized then that my attraction wasn't about replacing my husband. It was about recognizing parts of myself I'd abandoned to keep peace. The realization carried an unexpected tenderness. Desire felt less like hunger and more like recognition. That frightened me more than lust ever could, because recognition asks you to change. I went home knowing a decision was forming, even if I hadn't named it yet. Staying meant continuing to disappear slowly. Leaving meant hurting someone who had done nothing unforgivable. Neither option felt clean. Infidelity, I learned, isn't always about choosing someone else. Sometimes it's about choosing yourself too late, after your heart has already stepped beyond the boundaries you promised to respect. As I lay awake, I understood that denial had expired. Whatever came next would demand action or consequence. The quiet middle was gone. And once that space disappears, everything becomes painfully clear, even when the right choice still feels impossible. What happened next didn't explode the way people imagine betrayal does. There was no dramatic turning point. No single moment that announced everything had changed. It unfolded quietly, deliberately, like something we both understood without needing to spell out. We chose a time and place that felt neutral, almost forgettable, as if minimizing the setting could somehow contain the weight of what we were about to do. That was naive, but at the time it felt necessary. Being with him didn't feel reckless. That was the most unsettling part. It felt intentional, almost calm. There was no rush to pretend it was something it wasn't. No declarations, no fantasies about the future. Just two people acknowledging a connection they had tried and failed to ignore. I was aware of every choice I made, every step I took. There was no room for denial, and strangely, that made it easier to breathe. I wasn't being swept away. I was walking forward on my own. The guilt arrived later. Not immediately, not during, but afterward, when I was alone again. It showed up in fragments. In the way my house looked unchanged when I returned. In the sound of my husband's voice when he called that night. Unaware, affectionate, trusting. I responded the way I always had. And that familiarity felt heavier than anger ever could have. I realized then that betrayal isn't always about passion overpowering love. Sometimes it's about choosing something else despite it. He didn't ask me for more after that. He didn't push, didn't linger. He honored exactly what he had asked for, and nothing beyond it. That restraint made everything harder. There was no villain to blame, no obsession to condemn. Just two adults who had crossed a line knowing full well what it meant. The clarity I had felt before didn't disappear, but it came with consequences I couldn't escape. Days passed, and life continued as if nothing had happened. That normalcy was its own punishment. I cooked, I cleaned, I laughed at the right moments. From the outside, I was the same woman I had always been. Inside, I felt altered. Not broken, but reshaped. I had seen a version of myself that didn't fit neatly into the life I had built. And now I had to live with that knowledge. I thought I would regret him. I thought I would wish it had never happened. The truth was more complicated. I didn't regret the honesty of that moment. I regretted the cost. I regretted knowing that desire doesn't disappear just because you've chosen stability. That fulfillment and responsibility don't always align. Those realizations don't make you reckless, but they do make you restless. Eventually, the distance between us became real again. Not forced, not dramatic, just necessary. We didn't need to discuss it. We both understood that repeating it would turn something intentional into something careless. That boundary at least we respected. The connection faded into something quieter, less charged, but it never fully disappeared. It lived on as an understanding, a shared truth we carried separately, and why marriage didn't end. It didn't implode or unravel, but it changed in ways only I could feel. I became more present, oddly enough, more aware of what I had and what I risked. Some might call that irony. I call it consequence. I had looked beyond my life and come back with perspective I hadn't asked for, but couldn't unlearn. I don't tell this story to justify myself. I don't tell it to seek forgiveness. I tell it because infidelity isn't always about dissatisfaction or cruelty. Sometimes it's about confrontation, about meeting a part of yourself you've ignored and realizing that saying yes, even once, can follow you longer than saying no ever would. That I said yes to a wish that should have remained unspoken. And while life moved on, as it always does, I never fully returned to who I was before. Some choices don't ruin you. They just reveal you. And living with that revelation is a quiet, lifelong consequence no one else ever sees.